Next, we're going to move on to some of the properties of wool. And remember, I gave you that extensive table at the beginning when we talked about fibers. And I told you we were going to be going back to that table throughout the semester. So we're not going to talk about every single property of wool, but we are going to be reviewing the main properties of wool in the next few slides. Well, first we're going to talk about aesthetics, and the aesthetics of wool are variable. So wool does tend to have a matte luster. It's a specific look that really varies according to the type of animal that the wool came from. So we talked about, or actually we're going to talk about in the next section, the other categories of wool. We've been talking about mainly wool from sheep, but cashmere, camel, angora are also other types of wool. So we're going to talk about those in a minute. But depending on what animal the wool came from, they all still tend to have a matte luster. In addition, their drape and texture in hand can vary based on the yarn structure, the fabric structure, and what type of finish has been put on the actual yarn or on the textile, so on the fabric. So when we pull out, we're going to pull out our textile swatch book, and we're going to look at some sheer wools, some medium weight wools, and some medium weight flannels and tweeds. Fortunately, our textbook doesn't have any really heavyweight coatings or upholstery fabrics, and no wool sample in there. But the what's in our sample book will go across the different types of weights, and that's what your activity is going to be, is to explain the different types of weights. And because of its physical structure, wool does have a lot of body in their fabrics, and of course they are suitable for sweaters and suits. And their standard looks by which the manufactured fiber is measured, and we saw that in the micron system. So shorter wool fibers are sometimes blended with longer wool fibers, and especially things like especially wools like mohair are blended with other things to modify the fabric's luster or its texture. Wool is, though, it's very durable. It's a highly durable fabric, and that durability relates to its elongation and its elastic recovery. So basically, when stress is put on the fabric, that crimp that's in the fiber, right? That crimp uncoils, right? And when stress is removed, that crimp goes back. So it just goes back into its shape. And wool fibers, can bend back and forth about 20,000 times before they actually break, which is much different than cotton. Cotton only gets about 3,000 times to get bent back and forth, and our friend rayon only gets about 75% time. So, wool garments are much more durable than cotton, and much more so than rayon. And, moisture in the atmosphere also helps, wool retain its flexibility. So again, wool is a hair. So that moisture, just like your hair needs moisture, right? Wool thrives on that moisture. And wool fibers are durable and strong for these reasons. They have a combination of excellent flexibility and recovery, and that's why wool garments, if cared for properly, and we're going to talk about care in a minute, if cared for properly, last for a really long time. Comfort. Wool is comfortable, right? We talked about in the first half of the lecture how it is hygroscopic, and it's actually more hygroscopic than any other natural fiber. And it does very well under light rain or snow. Wool resists actually feeling wet, right? Because the water just runs off the fabric surface. And I mean, think about it. animals who live out in, they live out in nature, they need that water resiliency, right? So that's why wool is so great, because it's a hair of an animal that lives outside, right? So water just runs and beads off the fabric surface. So really that's just no surprise, because sheep actually thrive in really colder climates. Wool, however, does dry slower than other natural fibers, and that actually is part of the reason that it does trap the heat, right? It's more comfortable than any other fabric, because the wetness doesn't penetrate, and it dries a little bit faster. So, um, you know, warmth from the body is not dissipated quickly. It's a bad conductor of heat, so um, it um, it traps the heat in, right? That's why it's also good for colder climates. And since wool fibers have that natural crimp, they recover quickly from crushing. So continuing down our properties of wool list is the appearance, retention, so keeping its form. And wool receives really high ratings for this property. And I've said many times so far that it's a resilient fiber, and it resists and recovers really well from wrinkling. It does wrinkle a little bit more when it's wet, but we've talked about how it dries slowly, so those wrinkles kind of release themselves, and it retains its shape really well during normal use. Oftentimes, wool garments, though, are lined to help maintain its garment's shape, and we're going to talk about care in a minute. But when wool fabrics are dry cleaned, that's the best way to make them retain that shape. So again, wool tends to hold its shape, and it is very wrinkle resistant. The next property we're going to talk about, actually the final property we're going to talk about, is we're going to talk about care. And wool is as a natural protein fiber, and a luxury fiber. It does require more care than many of the other fibers we're going to talk about. Definitely more than the manufactured fibers, the synthetic fibers. But it has to be dry cleaned unless the wool is treated to be washable. Now, often merino wools are treated to be washable, which is interesting, but wool, it needs to be dry cleaned. It doesn't easily hold dirt, and the removal of dirt is relatively simple. And again, this is because it's a natural protein fiber, and I keep saying it's like your hair, but it's like your hair, right? Our hair doesn't really trap dirt and soil, and if it does, we can easily wash it out. Grease and oils, don't stain it. It really is just the fact that the shrinkage piece, again, often like our hair, the shrinkage piece is what happens for wool. So oftentimes it's best to layer wool garments, so wear a t-shirt underneath it, in part because it can be itchy. We've talked about that, but also to keep that oil on your skin from getting on it, because it requires the dry cleaning, right? Um, but you know, wool does pill. We talked about that in the first part of the lecture as well. It does pill, and it's just because, again, it's a natural fiber. So as you rub up against it, the fibers are so short that they start to break down, but then they gather together, and it does pill. So we do have to be concerned about that. So the best thing to do with wool is to watch the care instructions, right? So wool shouldn't be used with bleach at all. Because it will literally dissolve the wool. I mean, if you have a wool sweater at home that's coming apart, I just want to take one strand and put it in some chlorine bleach, and you will literally see it dissolve. And the other thing is that wool like we talked about in the first part of the lecture, it is susceptible to attacks by moths and moth larvae. Well, basically, moths will lay their eggs in wool garments, and they will use that. They will use that to eat. To eat. They don't digest it. They eat the fiber. Um, when they're in their chrysalis stage. So wool, again, that's why it's a luxury fiber, because it does take more care. It takes more to produce it, and it takes more care to keep it in good shape once you own it. So sustainability, wool is a sustainable fiber, but many consumers, because it is made from animal fur, they believe it's environmentally friendly, and it is a renewable resource, right? But it's not produced without any impact on the environment. So there does have to be some sustainable management in the physical resources for sheep growers, right? So generally, sheep graze in pastures, but they, can create soil erosion, um, if not managed well. We actually have sheep that graze on on the Chino campus, actually to kill the weed. So they actually are eating an invasive species there on the campus. So that works out. But also, there has to be take steps taken to make sure they don't overgraze. So we don't have the issue on our campus, but in other places where sheep graze, they do have to make sure they don't overgraze. The other concern in terms of sustainability is animal waste, and sheep manure. Um, there's tons of it, and um, it's just used to spread over the ground to return nutrients to the soil. But excessive applications can create problems with runoff, if the manure becomes contaminated. In terms of sheep's in the sustainability, continue to talk about sustainability. Sheep are susceptible to some diseases that can be transmitted to humans, and mostly that happens to sheep producers, so people that handle sheep on a regular basis. So, those of us that are just consumers of wool products, we don't we don't have to worry about being at risk. Sheep, though, are also susceptible to some parasitic infections, and the treatment of those infections sometimes does have a residue left on the garment. So again, that's why that washing, that cleaning of the wool in the production phase is really important. Um, the real concern is really just how the animals are treated, right? That's really what consumers are more concerned about. And just like free range chicken, right? How are the sheep treated as their hair is growing before it's shorn? And because of those concerns, some companies actually use barcodes that enable consumers to trace the path back to trace the path back from the wool back to the actual grower, and this process is called trace back. So just the ability to trace, back to the ranch where the sheep was raised is something that increasingly has become important in the sustainability world. And the last topic on sustainability is, it's just the environmental issues that relate to, the extensive use of water and energy to maintain the sheep to produce wool. Also, the chemicals that are used to clean the raw greasy wool fiber, the finishes that are put on garments, and the dyes that are used. So, wool is one of the only fibers that requires, hot water or solvent cleaning before it's processed into a yarn. So that adds an extra layer on the byproducts, the contaminants that it makes. So of course we get lanolin out of it, but there's still, some greasy sludge that has a high pollution index. And for first world manufacturers, it's not as bad, but for third world manufacturers, that can be a community contaminant. And while that grease is used for lanolin, the pesticides that's applied to the wools still gets washed off, and doesn't get washed off, and they have to use an extra solvent to get that wool. And then of course, since wool requires dry cleaning, there are all the dry cleaning solvents that have been known to be, possible carcinogens. So those are some of the sustainability issues in wool.